Hello everyone, my name is Brian, but you can call me the Bugler, and today we're going to be performing an exotic breakdown for the Hunter leg piece armor, the Orpheus Rig. Let's take a look. The Orpheus Rig, which I will henceforth just call the Rigs for the rest of this video, is an exotic leg piece armor designed specifically for the Night Stalker Hunter, so you won't see any additional benefits with the other two Hunter subclasses. The exotic perk is called Uncanny Arrows. It provides you ability energy when you tether enemies with your Shadowshot. This works with every version of the tether, although a little bit differently, so we'll have to cover the important distinctions when the time comes. Let's take a look at the cooldown reductions we can get with the base version of the tether. Before we start, however, I do want to talk about how I did these tests. What I did was tether a certain amount of enemies that I could control, from 1 to 5, without any abilities charged, and then allowed them to regenerate naturally. So, I did quite a bit of sitting around. At each level, I tested it 3 or 4 times, depending on how consistent the results were, and then I compared them all to make sure the numbers added up. Let's take a look now. All versions of the tether share the same amount of ability energy granted when you tether enemies with the rigs. The only difference between them is what the skill actually does. So the lockdown version, for example, will have an increased duration as well as range. The only difference between all of the versions of tether is its interactions with Quiver, which we'll cover towards the end of the video. Right now, we're just looking at a single tether and what it can do. We know that the base cooldown of our super is 400 seconds, our grenades 83 seconds, melee 95 seconds, and class ability 25 seconds. When you tether a single enemy, you're reducing your super down to about 391 seconds, your grenade to about 77 seconds, your melee to about 90.5 seconds, and your class ability to around 23 seconds. Now, the important thing to see here is that your grenade and class ability are both being reduced by the same percent, about 8%, whereas your melee ability is getting reduced by a lower percent, down to around 5%. And this remains constant at all levels, meaning that the grenade ability and class ability are both granted the same amount of energy percentage-wise at every single level of enemy tested, whereas the melee ability is always granted just a little bit less. We'll get to those exact numbers when we hit the important breakpoints a little bit later in the video. Let's take a look at what the tether does against 2 enemies. Against 2 enemies, the amount of ability energy we gain is more than double that of 1 enemy. This means it's not a linear ramp up depending on the amount of enemies tethered, it's more exponential. So against 2 enemies, our grenades go down to about 61.5 seconds, our class ability goes down to about 18.5 seconds, so for both of these, it's around a 26% energy granted. Our melee ability is now down to 72 seconds, about 24%, and our super is brought down to 360 seconds, exactly 10%. And these numbers increase in this manner up until the important breakpoint of 5, which we'll cover shortly. Before we talk about that though, I need to talk about some of the hidden things that this exotic perk does that aren't explicitly stated in the description. The first thing I want to talk about is the amount of ability energy granted depending on enemy tier. Enemy tier is completely irrelevant, meaning majors or dregs will all grant the exact same amount of ability energy. Where this changes though is when you actually kill the enemies. The rigs allows you to gain super energy from the enemies that you have tethered, which is something that you're not able to do with the base version of the tether, meaning you can increase your super cooldown a lot more right after you use your tether by killing the enemies that you had tethered. In addition to this, you also gain a small amount of ability energy when you actually hit enemies with the tether and not straight up suppress them with the tether. This means that when you hit an enemy directly and damage them with the tether, you'll grant a small amount of ability energy to yourself. It's somewhere around 3%. This does not increase with Quiver, and we'll talk about that specifically very soon. But first, let's talk about our important breakpoint. At 5 enemies tethered, we reach the point in which our grenade, melee, and class ability can all be recharged at once. Even though our melee ability trails behind at all levels prior to this, a 5th enemy is enough to charge all 3 from 0%. Now in this example, you'll see a dreg get tethered, leave the tether, and re-enter. This counts as a 5th enemy in a chain, even though it was one of the 4 originally tethered, and therefore grants an increased amount of energy. I can calculate this by taking the amount of energy granted to our super at 5 enemies and compare it to the one at 4. At 5 enemies, we receive 42% energy, bringing our cooldown to 232 seconds. At 4 enemies, we grant 38% energy to ourselves, bringing the cooldown to 248 seconds. This is an important distinction for when enemies are crowding around, because it means that if enemies leave and re-enter the tether, you'll be granting an exponential increase to your super cooldown, even if all your other abilities are already cooled down. Let's take a look at another version of the tether and see how the rigs behave here. I'm referring to Moebius Quiver. This is a skill in the Way of the Pathfinder skill tree that replaces your normal Shadowshot with the ability to fire up to 6 arrows. Each arrow has a reduced duration as well as a reduced range. But what does that mean for the rigs? Well, let's take a look. When you activate Moebius Quiver, your super bar remains filled. This means that when you tether enemies, you're unable to receive any super energy. However, you will still gain ability energy. What this means is the only time you will get super energy is if your last tether activates after your super runs out. This means you have to wait until the absolute last moment to fire your final shot, otherwise you'll be granted absolutely no energy. And since this energy is granted when you either hit an enemy with a tether or when the tether activates, any previous tether aside from the final one you shoot will not grant super energy, although it will still grant ability energy. All of this talk about ability energy had gotten me thinking. We know that at 5 enemies tethered, we regenerate all of our ability energy from 0. Well, what about Moebius Quiver? With 6 shots, we might be able to regenerate that against a single boss enemy. However, in practice, this does not work, because each tether registers as its own individual tether, so each one only starts the first piece of the chain. So if we tag the modular mind and tether them with all 6 shots, we only gain about 11% energy for each hit we land. This is not enough to regenerate our grenades, and actually really disappointed me because I was hoping for some serious DPS here. Alright, now let's talk about what I consider to be the best version of tether to use with the rigs. I'm of course referring to Heart of the Pack without Moebius Quiver unlocked. This allows you to gain extra orbs when you kill tethered enemies without suffering the range and duration penalty of using Moebius Quiver. And since you only fire your Shadowshot once, you're able to regenerate your supers and even chain them provided there are enough enemies. In this example, you'll see me chain my super quite a few times. In addition to this, I make so many orbs it's almost unbelievable. I'm talking 42 orbs in less than a minute unbelievable. In fact, the rig has another strange interaction with tether in which it allows you to circumvent what I thought was the 10 orb limit. I have it on film quite a few times of me getting way more than 10 orbs with one tether, but only when using this setup. I was able to generate, at most, 17 orbs with one tether. This is very odd, and I thought I observed it with Deadfall as well. Unfortunately, I was unable to replicate it and therefore cannot confirm it. It's also possible to be done with Moebius Quiver as well, but it's a little bit harder because of how Moebius Quiver actually works. Alright, now that the breakdown's out of the way, let's move on to my opinion on this exotic. I believe the Orpheus Rig is an excellent exotic. Not only does it embody what I believe an exotic should be, in that it's fun to use and changes the way you play, it's also extremely effective. If it only granted ability energy, meaning your grenade, melee, and class ability, it would still be an extremely good exotic. The fact that it also grants super energy is just unbelievable to me. I can't believe that they actually missed this during testing, which leads me to believe that they did it on purpose. I really hope the exotic stays intact as it is, and other more lackluster exotics are brought up to par with it, because this is what an exotic should be. They don't always have to be as effective, they just need to be as fun. That's the point, isn't it? To have fun? That's what I really like about the Orpheus Rig. the ability to just smile as I'm using it, and it's something that I rarely saw when using some of the other effective exotics. Even though they were effective, they weren't nearly as fun, and they didn't just make me happy to use like this one does, or the Celestial Nighthawk does for that matter. The only issue that I have with this exotic is more with its interaction with Moebius Quiver than the exotic itself. If instead of each tether starting its own chain, the entire Shadowshot while using Moebius Quiver counted in the chain, I could see this as being an excellent combination, because you'd be able to get 2 grenades just on one single enemy. However, with it as it stands, you're almost gimping yourself by unlocking Moebius Quiver. Really, if you already unlocked Moebius Quiver and you don't want to restart your hunter like I'm going to do for the 3rd time very soon, you're better off using the top skill tree, the Way of the Trapper, with this one. And now I'm just going to talk briefly about how the exotic looks. I think this thing is pretty aesthetic, but I do have a couple of issues with it. The first one is where the quiver actually is on our body. Our guardian fires the Shadowshot with his right hand, and the way that the quiver is angled leads me to believe that it's so you can fire arrows quicker. I'm not really familiar with archery, but that's just what makes sense to me. So it being on our left side, if anything, would just make us fire the arrows slower, because we'd have to reach behind our back based on the angle here. The next issue I have is with the clipping. You can see in this clip that my hand and cape are both clipping through the arrows and quiver. That's just me being ridiculous. I just don't like how it looks, in this case. During normal gameplay, and when other Guardians have it equipped and they're using their guns, it's not nearly as egregious as it is here, and it still looks really cool. The purple glowing arrows look real cool at night in this game. And that's the end of this breakdown. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions about how I conducted the tests, or why I might not have included other footage, please let me know in the comments so I could answer them for you. I'd also like to preempt a question here. I'm willing to bet a lot of you are curious as to why I didn't include the amount of enemies we need to tether in order to fully regenerate our super. The short answer is, I couldn't figure that out. I couldn't get a situation that was controlled enough to only tether enemies without them getting killed, either by myself or people interfering during public events. So, I'd rather not report this number than be wrong and reporting it. My next video will finally be the release of my Hunter Best in Show video. It's been a long time coming, and I'm really excited for this. My Best in Show videos require quite a time investment from me, getting the footage and figuring out what subclass I truly believe is the best in each activity we've chosen is something I take seriously, and I won't put it out unless I'm completely confident in the information I'm showing. I'm trying to get this video out on Friday at the latest. I'm working hard on it now and will continue to do so even through Thanksgiving if need be. As per usual, I'll be going live on Twitch shortly after this video releases to play some Iron Banner and do a Q&A with you guys. If you'd like to join me, you can find the link to my Twitch channel in this video's description, as well as the link to our clan, Patreon, and Discord server. Anyone is welcome to join the Discord server. It's a nice community where we get together and talk about all things Destiny. So once again, thanks for watching, I hope I see you next time, and good luck getting through the exclusion zone.